Hello, and in this video we will be covering array lists. In Java, they are very similar to arrays, but there are a couple things that makes them different. Firstly is the way we declare them. So to declare an int array, we would type in the keyword int, square brackets, give it the name, and then we can set it equal to some values, or we could do new int and then we give it a size, and then we can initialize each of those values independently. Now, an array list is a little bit different. You call it by using the keyword ArrayList, and then you put these two arrows, the greater than and less than key, and then you give it the type. Now, we want an int array list, but we cannot just simply put int, and you will see in a second, and I'll give it a name, int arr list. And for an array list, we always put the same thing after the equal sign to initialize it. We will put equals new array list, we will put the type, and then the brackets open and close. Now you see we get an error, and this is just because we have to use the class type and not the primitive type. So the class type is integer because int is a type from integer. The primitive type is int with a lowercase. So what the lowercase int means, a primitive type basically means it needs to have a value. You cannot initialize it or use it without a value. So to make this easier to understand, if I have a variable, then I can give it any type, and the type can be int, string, boolean. Now you must notice here that string will actually work if I were to input that into the array list, because it's already a class type, and that's just an import error. We have to import java.util.ArrayList. So string already works because string is a class type. It doesn't have a lowercase s version of it. Its string basically doesn't have a primitive type. A boolean, an integer, a double, a float, all of the ones with lowercase are primitive types, and they need to be set as a variable. You cannot simply just set it without the variable name, and this is basically what this is doing. This is saying it's referring to the class of string or the class of integer. So if we put integer here, it's now referring to the class of integer. Say I made a custom class here. I'll just do it down here in the same file, and I'll just call this pet, and I had a constructor like so. Now, what if I had a primitive type of pet? Well, I'm not going to show you how to do this in this video, but say for example I did. Well, if I put pet in here, it wouldn't work. And it's going to show an error, obviously, but it wouldn't work because how are we going to refer to the class if we are giving it the non-class type of it? That's basically what this is saying. If you were to put pet in here, it would work because it's referring back to the class, and inside of that class is the primitive type. That's basically why you have to put the capitals. So once you have that done, then you have your array list complete. Now this is gonna have a size of 0 automatically because we did not give it any elements. Now array lists are different than arrays because if you call int arr.length, you're actually going to get 4. Or if you initialize with length, it's going to give 5. So let's initialize this int array with a length of 10. So every element is going to be initialized to 0, and I explained why in the arrays video at the end why this is initialized to 0 as to instead a string array would be initialized to null. I explained that in the video, so I suggest you go watch that. And the array list of integer is going to be size 0, length 0. You can give it a size, and I will show how to do that in a second. So if we print this out, and I'll just copy this line here just to go faster. So we will print the array list length, and we will print the array list. So we will print the array length and then the array list size. Now you notice we have to do size, and it's going to highlight this here. and say the result of the size is always 0, and that's what we will get when we run this application. We get 10 and we get 0. Now that's because this is of size 10 or length 10 for the array. You should always think of arrays as length and not size. An array list has the size, the amount of elements. Now in these normal brackets here at the end, you can input a number. So right here where it's highlighted, you can input a number at these brackets, and that's going to be the size. If I input 10, the initial capacity, as you can see it automatically fills it in for me, is going to be 10. So now when I print this, it should print size 10. If it doesn't, I will explain why. So when I run this, it still prints 0 and 10. And here is why. The ArrayList size function, e.size, returns the amount of elements in the array that are initialized. So basically what this is saying, we input an initial capacity of 10, but we never initialized or input any elements into this, so it's always going to return 0 because it has no elements. This .size function is basically the same as saying for every element that we initialized in this array list, return every element plus 1 basically, so it's counting the elements. So in this array up here where we have a 10 as the length, if this had a .size function, this would return 0 because we never initialized the elements. So let's initialize these elements using a basic for loop. So we'll do for int I is equal to 0, I is less 10, and then we give it the size that we want to input. Now we can't do what we did with arrays and input the .size function because it doesn't work, so we have to input a number that we want to use. So we'll just do 20, and you can see you're asking maybe, oh, this is 20 and this is 10, how is this going to work? That's what makes ArrayList useful, is you don't need to know the actual size that you need to use. But if you do know the size that you want to use and you want to use the functionalities of ArrayList, then you should input the size here. And then we'll increment I by 1. And we'll add an integer because it has to be of an type integer, and we'll just input the number I. And now when we print size, it should print 20. Now you realize here it prints 20 and it doesn't print anything else like 19 because size also is the same as length. It doesn't go by index, it goes by the amount. So to recap, if the ArrayList had a .length function, this would return 10 initially, and then we add 20 elements to the ArrayList, which would overwrite the elements, well not overwrite, but basically add them to the next spot. An ArrayList can sort of be thought of as stacking elements, so if you have a slot for 10, you can put 10 elements in, and when you need more space, you double the size. So basically how ArrayLists work is instead of an int array, if you have an integer array list and you have 10 elements and you want to add an 11th one, it's going to add the 11th one, but it's going to double the array list size, so you're going to have 20 elements in the array list. Because array lists are dynamic arrays, they change in size, basically the same as arrays, except you can change the size dynamically and it doesn't have to be a static size.